Hello, everyone. This is Amanda Moreno, and I will be talking to you today about queer astrology and queering astrology, which is a really vast topic, but we're going to be kind of taking a visual tour through it and seeing what comes up. So first off, just a little bit about me and why I picked this topic today. There's a lot of reasons. One is that I'm very, very interested in experiential and embodied astrology because they tend to bring a person's experience to the forefront, which I think is really amazing because that helps them to seek the truth from inside themselves based on their own experience of what they're feeling and what their lives have been like. And so the kind of like queer astrology movement has something that has sprung up, just in the past 5 to 10 years, although I would say there's always been queer astrologers. And it's really focusing on helping people to reclaim a sense of sovereignty about their experience, rather than looking to external sources of truth. And so for me, as a member of the queer community, it's also really important to me that I help to talk about queer themes with other astrologers and healing arts practitioners, because I still get a lot of clients who come to me who share experiences of going to see therapists or astrologers who have pathologized their gender identity or sexual orientation. And so I think that education is a really big part of kind of flipping that script. And so gratitude for this lecture to Queer Astrology Conference, the folks who keep running that, Rhea Wolf, Ian Weisler, Chani Nicholas does a lot in terms of, interviews and things like that to talk about what a great pairing queerness and astrology are. I have the link to an article from Mashable.com that it's a really great kind of overview of what's going on with the combination of queerness, astrology, and witchiness. I've done an EA Zoom meeting before on non-monogamous relationship styles, and I do put non-monogamous relationships under the bracket of queerness. So you can look that up for a bunch of other information. And so here we go. Outline, we're going to look at markers for queerness in the chart, a basic exploration of what queer identities are and what that means. And so we'll get some definitions in there. Talk about kind of the overlap of astrology as a more Uranian discipline and queerness. And then we'll talk about just kind of like experiential exercises that you can do with clients or just with yourself in order to help learn your chart a little bit better while you learn about active imagination and journeying and all those wonderful experiential things. And then we'll go through a little journey to just kind of explore how the experiential techniques work. Okay, so markers for queerness in a chart. You're looking at a chart. You want to see if somebody is gay or straight, for example, or what kind of relationship style they might prefer. And so the answer there is none, right? So as evolutionary astrologers know, when it comes to things like evolutionary state, you can't look at the chart to understand. What you can do is have the chart in hand, and then when the person comes in, you listen for their experience, you listen to what they're going through, and then you can relate it to the chart to kind of see what the evolutionary intent might be. But as always, at least the way that I practice astrology, it's really important to refrain from letting somebody give you all their power, right? So you're using the chart to kind of understand the map of the soul, keep your own assumptions in the background, and help them to kind of reveal themselves to you and reveal themselves to themselves a lot of the time. So there are things that you can look at in the chart. Like people will say that Mars conjunct Venus can be a sign for queerness, or Mars conjunct Venus in Gemini can be a sign for kinkiness or bisexuality, right? There you see like the flavors of like magnetism and desire kind of like combining in the sign of, perpetual curiosity. And there are astrologers who have done work in terms of understanding, transgender identities through the chart, or understanding gay and lesbian identities through the chart. And so I know that Rose Marcus has done some of that, and Maurice Fernandez has done some of that, and they've done some really good work. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. All right, so just heading into this, as I was saying, it's really important to just kind of like check your own assumptions and what your value systems, especially if you're a practicing astrologer, to just kind of like leave that on the side. And so questions are, what assumptions do you have about what it means to be female or male or transgender or gay or straight? What assumptions do you have about relationships in terms of, do you think that everyone desires a relationship? Do you think that relationships need to be monogamous? How do these assumptions play out in your day-to-day interactions? I mean, with clients, but with yourself as well, or with other humans. Because it's likely that none of your assumptions are actually a given, right? They're all a result of our conditioning and our expectations and what we're taught by our families and our surroundings. So what would happen if you left your assumptions at the door when you're talking to somebody who identifies differently than you? Okay. And so here we have an image from the Cosmic Tribe Tarot deck, which is balance, and it's usually associated with the Libran archetype. And you can see this kind of more androgynous figure being reflected there. All right. So just basic definition of terms. We're going to break down kind of queerness in general a little more specifically, but when I say LGBTQ, I'm referring to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. Anytime somebody in your life or a client comes in using a label like one of these or any other, it can be best to just say, what does that mean for you? What does that mean to you? How do you relate to that? And so terms like lesbian and gay usually have more straightforward meanings, but a lot of the other ones don't. POC is person of color, and it tends to be that within the queer community, it also is including people of color, people who are differently abled. So that the community kind of, queerness kind of becomes an umbrella term for a lot of different things. Ethical non-monogamy is things like polyamory, open relationships, and that's an umbrella term that encompasses all the ways you can consciously, with agreement and consent from all involved, explore multiple loving and sexual relationships with multiple people. And I just kind of have like a flurry of other terms that you might hear down here. So pansexual, somebody who is attracted to all genders rather than just bisexual. Kinky, you'll find themes of body positivity, consent culture. Individuals who identify as non-binary, so they're not choosing male or female on the gender spectrum, and the list goes on. So when we're talking about queerness, what are we talking about? So queer indicates broadly anyone who does not conform to traditional patterns and norms. All right. So we're starting to get a feel for queerness being usually something that people will use when they are outside the norm, when they are living an unconventional life, or where they don't feel a need to adhere to rigid labels. Oftentimes queer folks are, either consciously or not, kind of understanding that identity is a fluid thing. And so there can be just a resistance to clinging on to those identity labels. All right. So then kind of a more in-depth label is, or in-depth definition is, anyone committed to knowing who they are in all their parts without relying on stereotypical, pre-assigned, or socially acceptable notions of gender, sexuality, relationships, time, and space. To be queer is to be open to the moment. To be queer is to focus on the process of creating a life rather than on producing labels, constructing ideologies, or manufacturing stability. And both of these definitions I got out of the Queer Anthology, which is transcripts from the first Queer Astrology conference. And so I've paired this definition or explanation with the star card from the tarot, and that is associated with the sign of Aquarius. And we can definitely hear Aquarian themes coming through in these definitions, right? It's somebody who is different than or outside of the norm. And so there's a lot of work with shrugging off conditioning that's happening here, again, an Aquarian theme. And so it's worth just kind of reviewing a couple basic things that we understand about the Aquarius or Uranian archetypes. And there's overlap between the two because they're related. And so, if we're looking at more like concrete symbols, we have the rebel or the exile or the outsider or the humanitarian or the mad scientist. Aquarius is usually associated with the urge to follow one's own path. All right. So there's that path of creative self actualization, embracing one's own spark of genius. That's how we incorporate the Leo polarity there. And in a lot of ways, this, as we move into the age of Aquarius, these are the themes that are going to become so important for us to be learning about. What does it mean to decondition? What does it mean to follow the path of individuation, which is the path of kind of like hearing your own call to adventure, hearing the call of your soul and following it. And within Aquarius, we see that basic archetypal conflict between Saturn and Uranus, right? So Saturn is the structures and laws that kind of keep society functioning. And it's also repression and confines. And so there's inherent tension within the archetype of Aquarius itself, because it does have dual rulership. So Saturn and Uranus both belong in there. But where Saturn is seeking to maintain the status quo, Uranus is seeking to break it down, not just for the sake of destruction for itself, but Uranus, or the Aquarian energy, is looking at the structures and saying, is this still serving? Where did this come from? Is this getting in the way of or supporting, providing a foundation for my own path of individuation? Because I know that following that path is important for the greater good, is important for society and the betterment of society and humanity. And so that inherent tension is that as we start to differentiate, as we start to decondition from, the structures and confines of Saturn, there's at once a sense of liberation, but there's also that sense of being different. And there is the potential for being rejected by society, and there's the potential for being outcast and exiled and made into an outsider, right? We feel the exhilaration of following our path, but at the same time, we see our difference and the ways that we don't quite fit in. And so our culture doesn't really like difference. Or humans don't tend to like difference. Humans and human culture and society, at least in the past 10,000 years, tend to vilify difference. And that vilification often takes a very violent and scary turn. And so that can be in the form of outward violence, like we see with the witch burnings or genocide or any of many examples from history. But it can also just be, when somebody gets outcast from their home, their basic survival needs, this is the square to Taurus, gets threatened as well. Will they have shelter? Will they have a place to stay? And so there's these kind of collective mass traumas that carry through the Aquarian archetype that can awaken when somebody is holding a secret, like they aren't attracted to the opposite sex, they're attracted to the same sex. Or they don't feel like they are actually, a female, and they're in a female's body. They feel like they're a male. And so there's these questions of difference that start to come up. And as Uranus is also related to, the long-term memory, the subtle memory, the individuated unconscious, our cells and our different energy bodies carry the memories of the times that we have been outcast because of our difference. All right, so we see this in the modern day queer movement in terms of just looking at stats, like the fact that about 50% of homeless teenagers or homeless children are queer. They identify as a member of the LGBTQ community, right? And so oftentimes those are young people who have recognized this difference in themselves and told their families, and their families can't handle it, and their families can't tolerate it. And so then the child is either cast out or makes a decision to go live on the streets, right? And essentially finds a community of their own. And we find this in the fear that people face in coming out, whether it's to their families or if they've been in a marriage for a long period of time or at work. Um, and this isn't just with the LGBTQ community, right? This is with people who have different relationship styles. This is with people who have sexual fetishes, or sexual kinks that are practiced between consenting adults. There's a lot of secrecy that goes into gender identity and sexual identity because people do have fear, of the repercussions of that. Okay, and so that kind of just brings me back to the importance of, cultural competency when it comes to these things. That's not to say that like every practicing astrologer has to be um, fully knowledgeable in issues pertaining to the queer community, but knowing when to refer somebody is really important. And also just, again, withholding judgment, right? You don't know a soul's path. You don't know what it's doing, even though we can get some clues from the chart. Um, and so it's keeping your assumptions to yourself, checking your values, and helping the person to uncover their own personal truth. All right, any questions at this point? Okay. And I think before we go to queering mythology, I do just want to kind of like tie those connections between, astrology as a Uranian or Aquarian discipline and queerness. And there are those who will say that astrology is a Saturnian thing or a Saturnian discipline, and I disagree, and that's fine. I think that, it's important to understand the history and the tradition of astrology for sure, and to give it its due because we want to take everything within context. But to me, the beauty of astrology is that it allows people to find their own truth, right? Underneath a connected cosmos, a connected collective, right? And so it allows for that navigation of identity, and it allows for that navigation of path, and it supports it. All right. So what are ways that we can queer astrology? And this is kind of taking it out of a Saturnian paradigm into a Uranian or Aquarian one. And one of the ways is by really understanding that so much of, of what we learn about astrology is based in Greco-Roman mythology. And Greco-Roman mythology is incredibly important, and it's rich, and the stories really get at the complexity of the human experience, and sometimes the really messed up nature of the human experience. But it's not the only mythology, right? And a lot of what Greco-Roman mythology has done is split things down into binaries: male, female, rational, irrational, black, white. Especially as, through the evolution of human consciousness, we have we've become kind of a headline culture, right? We've gone away from exploring the depths and complexities of things like mythology. And in a lot of ways, mythology is seen as being the equivalent of a lie at this point. So when we queer when we queer mythology, we're taking a step out of looking at Mars as strictly male, right? We're taking a step out of looking at Venus as female, or Cancer as mother, and Capricorn as father. We're looking for mythologies that show all kinds of gender identities and all kinds of body relationships. So for example, I just have a bunch of different images here, and you can see, the top left is the Devil card from the Cosmic Tribe Tarot. And I love this depiction because in so many of and with the Devil card, we're talking about Saturn and Capricorn archetypes. And with a lot of the decks, the Devil card is shown in a way that expresses a lot of fear, or is showing people being chained to their fears, chained to their obligations, chained to their responsibilities. Again, it's Capricorn. But in this deck, there's a much more whimsical attitude going on, and it's showing Pan and it's showing the serpent, and it's showing a phallus at the bottom, and it's really getting at this kind of like, yeah, we are spirit incarnate in flesh suits, and part of that is that we get to play and we get to have fun in the body and we get to have fun in the material world. Where it becomes problematic is when we get chained to it, right? So we're just kind of getting a different take there. Or this Lover's card is not really showing this kind of like romantic situation. It's showing the fear and complexity that arises when two people or two things start to meld. The image in the center, you know, the figure with the sun, and then the Ace of Wands card, the woman hugging the phallus card from the tree, you know, that shows a side of what we would call femininity, or the female body, that is more lusty and is more fiery and is more dynamic, because after all, Venus is also the goddess of war, right? In a lot of cultures, there is that association with, you know, Venus, the actual planet, being connected with war. And we can look into the different faces of the goddess and see that she's not just some being arising out of the ocean in a clamshell that's all pretty and perfect. There's lots of layers there. We see the little girl face to face with the wolf here. We see the Prince of Cups and kind of what I would call a softer side of a masculine body or a male body. And then we see, you know, in the bottom left corner, emergence. And again, that balance card just showing male bodies in ways that are not typical. But there's also comfort with body here too, right? There's nudity in saying like this, yes, the human body is a natural part of our existence. We can also see here different depictions of what relationship looks like. So here's 3 depictions of the Lover's card from the Cosmic Tribe deck that's trying to be more inclusive. So, you know, if somebody comes in to a tarot consultation, they can actually see themselves reflected more. This is the same thing with paying attention to whether or not, you know, bodies are all depicted as white in decks. But with an astrological consultation, again, it's just not making assumptions. If somebody's talking about their partner, their relationship, it's not necessarily going to be another sex, right? We don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know whether or not it's going to be monogamous. And then in terms of what sex and sexuality look like, sometimes sex is between 2 people. Sometimes it's between more than one person. Sometimes people choose to abstain from sex. They don't have sexual relationships with other people, but they're still romantic with other people. Part of this is also talking about body, talking about masturbation, and that's the Taurian archetype, self-pleasure and self-love. And so part of this queering astrology experience is about bringing all the dynamics and dimensions of human experience into the room. And again, if you're not a consulting astrologer, it's just keeping your mind open to those things for your own life, questioning, you know, why you have chosen a monogamous relationship or a polyamorous relationship. Is it because monogamy is the only thing you've ever seen? Is it because all of your friends are polyamorous? And so again, it's just that question of why and what is this revealing? And remembering that sometimes, you know, our biggest relationships are with places or the earth, which I've tried to get at with this picture of my hand holding some beautiful rocks. All right, any questions at this point? Okay. And so along with the mythological component, we don't have to use gendered words, right? So we don't have to say Mars is male and Venus is female. And I've heard several astrologers say that's really difficult, and that's fine. I think to me, it's just, you know, again, being aware, like I'm making assumptions about things when I associate male with Aries. I mean, what would a Venus in Aries person say about that, right? It's going to be something different there. But again, also just going to the individual experience, somebody who is exploring their gender identity might find it really empowering to use male and Mars or Aries together. But we can switch it up. We can make Aries and Mars about desire. We can make it about impulse or impulsiveness or emergence or coming into existence. And so that kind of energy that fuels those things, right? Just like Venus can be magnetism. And I put receptivity for a Venus keyword, but I've even been questioning that one because I think that puts it in a polarity with action, right? And receptivity can also be a very active thing. So making the choice to receive. It doesn't have to be a passive thing. It can be very empowered. And then with Cancer and Capricorn, we're getting to traditional, the moon is mother and the sun Saturn is father. And that can be very relevant to a person. But what if a person did grow up with, two fathers? Or what if the father was the primary caregiver? Or what if it was a single parent household? And so when we are conscious of our vocabulary around these things, we can get more creative with our keywords, and we can use words that are more robust in their meanings, right? So shepherding or nurturing, primary caregiver, or just using Cancer to refer to the emotional body. Where Capricorn can be structure and discipline. It can also be the primary caregiver. And, even in evolutionary astrology, we associate the Cancer Capricorn archetypes or the 4th, 10th house with gender switching, right? And so there is a fluidity there. There is that learning about different aspects. And then we have archetypes that are, we would consider them to be more androgynous, like Aquarius or Libra or even Gemini to an extent. So that's all of the air signs. All right, so the point being, we need inquiries into personal truth and experience. Okay, so we can no longer really rely on universal truths being universally relevant. And it can be detrimental to have people, coming to astrology and then being told their truth, right? Like we're living in a paradigm where the Christian church has made it so that most people seek truth outside themselves. And so in my belief, at least, we need more people seeking truth from within themselves. And astrology provides a way to do just that. And astrology empowers us to find the truth ourselves without being given identities. And it allows for the nuance of human experience. And so in this sense, there with that article that I referred to in one of the first screens, there's this kind of phenomena going on where millennials are increasingly into astrology and they're into witchiness. And they're into reclaiming the importance of, connecting with the mystery. And making meaning out of things. Of course, this is not all millennials, but there is this kind of void that's been left, and they're stepping into these older ways of knowing, which is a really incredible thing. And so it's just remembering to make sure we have reverence for the vastness of the archetypes and sensitivity to trauma that can come out with certain people when they are, coming out or exploring their identity. And so just holding space for healing with compassion. Any questions? Okay. So, I've been kind of floating around this theme of queer astrology for many years now. But I think it's particularly relevant right now as we're working with this Uranus and Taurus switch. And I've been kind of like mushing my Uranus and Taurus keywords around a lot. And embodying the change is one of my favorite terms for Uranus and Taurus at this point. Because Taurus is very much embodiment, and Uranus is change, right? And we've gone through so much with Uranus and Aries of this kind of spark of revolution, but there's also been a lot of shakeup, and now it's like the time to integrate those changes, right? And it's not as straightforward as that. Uranus and Taurus is, in fact, trauma to body and survival fears and all of that as well. But what a fantastic opportunity for those who are able to kind of work through that shift. Okay. And so I wanted to just go through some specific, things that I do to queer astrology when I'm, at workshops or teaching, or when I'm just working with astrology myself. And this is, again, to just help it to be a more embodied experience rather than just like reading a book and memorizing things, right? So it's bringing the intuition in, and it's bringing memories into play, and it's bringing what the body is feeling and experiencing into play. And so one of the things I love to do is play with essential oils and scents. So like if there's a new moon coming up, what essential oils are associated with that? Or like if I think it's going to be a really heady new moon, what's a grounding essential oil? And so when I'm, starting a workshop, I might just pass around a vial of oil for everyone to smell. And every little detail of that response is key. Like, is there a repulsion to the smell? Is there a repulsion to the archetype? Is there a memory that comes up? And, the basic thing here, what I have written kind of towards the top, is trusting psyche and experience, because the psyche is going to communicate to each individual person in individual ways and in very robust ways, right? So the psyche communicates, yes, through images, like we remember from dreams, but images are these huge worlds of information. And so you have like the visual depiction, but you have color, and you have the way an image makes you feel, and you have the way an image lodges in your body and provokes maybe a pain or like a rumbling in the stomach. And you have memory response through those images. So you can see an image and all of a sudden you seemingly randomly remember an event from childhood. And then you might be able to connect the dots between something that's going on in your life today. And so layering our astrological experience with all these different ways of knowing helps us, again, to get at the vastness of the archetypes while anchoring it down to earth. So bringing, tarot cards that correspond, working with tarot cards is great because, again, there's visual symbolism. Making art. So for astrological transits, I love to make collages, or for new moons. And sometimes it's a really like drawn out affair, and other times I just get out some magazines and cut some things up and put them together. Astrodrama is a fantastic experiential exercise for astrology, and that's essentially when you're asking people to step into the field of the archetypes and act it out. So you take a configuration from someone's chart, like Mars square Venus, and you have one person stand as Mars and another person stand as Venus, and maybe get one person to stand as the 4th house and one for the 7th house. And then you just have them interact, and you trust that when you're setting the intention of invoking the energy of those archetypes, that they will play out. And oftentimes that's a fantastic way for a person to have a mirror into their own psyche and their own experience. Meditation and grounding, so setting space for yourself before astrological inquiries or in workshops, just helps to like ground and center in the present moment. That's bringing it back into body. Memory tracing, which I talked about a little bit. So you're having a really heavy Saturn experience and you're feeling, really, really depressed. You can't quite get out of it. So it's just kind of like amplifying that. Okay, where do I feel that depression in my body? Okay, it's in my left shoulder. All right, if I just amplify that and lean into it, what comes? And then a memory from childhood when you fell and like hurt your shoulder and nobody was there for you. And so it was overwhelming. All right. And so you're just kind of like drawing those connections. Celebrations of uniqueness and community. You know, when I've gone to workshops hosted by queer astrologer folks, it's fascinating because there's always space for people to talk about their own experience of what something means. So, you know, somebody might associate the midnight point of their chart with one thing and somebody else associates it with another. And so by sharing those stories of what the moon in Libra means or the sun in Aquarius means, you're able to just kind of start to connect those dots a little bit more. Um, and then journeying and guided visualizations are great too. And so what I kind of want to do is just lead you through a little example of one of these guided visualizations just to see what comes. But before I do that, any questions? I love asking for questions. Okay. So what I'm going to ask you to do is visualize a spot in your chart, really. And I'll lead you through this, but I'm going to explain it first. I'm going to have you visualize a spot in your chart. So that could be a planet, that could be an angle, that could be a spot in your chart that is currently being transited by something, anything you want to explore more. So if you're keeping it easy, it could just be, you know, your sun or your moon. If you're more advanced in your astrological studies, it could be a part that you're kind of like struggling to understand. So a conjunction or something like that. And I'm just going to have you ground and center and then just kind of visualize your chart in your mind's eye. And then I'll ask you to imagine that the chart becomes a 3D object, right, that you get to walk around in. And the goal of this is to get some information that's helpful to you, but really it's a playful exercise. And so you're just, you know, you're pretending, you're imagining. That doesn't make it less real, but you're going to just kind of accept whatever comes. And so it might not be some like groundbreaking insight. You might get a color or a sound or just a feeling, but it's just paying attention to all of those different things. And so it's helping you to learn about your own embodied experience, but it's also helping you to learn about how your perceptions work, right? Whether it's visual or just knowing or feeling or something like that. So go ahead and just pick a spot. You know, if you're watching this on the recording, you could always just pause it for a little bit until you figure it out or stare at your chart a little bit. So you just pick a spot. Then just go ahead and close your eyes. Take a couple really deep breaths in and out. And if you have a process of grounding that you prefer, go ahead and do that. You know, grow roots into the ground, whatever that might be. And again, you can just pause this at any point if it's moving too fast. And so go ahead and just bring that image to mind, the image of your chart. You can't visualize it in its full detail, just, you know, intend to visualize the part that you're focused on. And now just kind of sinking deeper into that, you just imagine that the chart kind of like falls down in front of you. So it becomes a big thing, a multi-dimensional thing that you could walk around on. And just go ahead and walk or float over to the spot that you've chosen. So over to the planet or the point. So for example, go stand on your sun, just facing the center of the wheel. And as you do that, again, just breathing, just notice what comes. How does it feel to be standing in that spot? What are you aware of? And you might have expectations going into this. Like if you're working with a planet like Mars, you might be expecting something. Just be open to what's actually there, what you actually feel or experience. maybe ask for a symbol of that planet or point to appear to you. And if a symbol appears or a memory appears, see if you can interact with it. For our purposes now, you just might want to ask it a question, but let's keep it simple. And again, just tune in. Do you notice something tugging at you from another side? Do you feel resistance? And again, if you'd like to spend longer with this exercise, you can just pause it. But for our purposes here, I'm going to ask you to just bring your attention back to your breathing and come back into the room that you're at. And so with that exercise, you know, one of the things you can do is if you're exploring like an opposition in your chart, go stand on one planet, get a feel for it, and then tune in across the circle. What does that feel like? What happens if you walk to the middle? What does it feel like there? And the more that you do things like this, the more adept you can get at kind of tuning in and figuring out, again, how your psyche communicates to you. Any questions about any of that? Okay. So that is about all that I have for this round of EA Zoom meetings. You can find info, where to connect with me, where to sign up for my Patreon, and a little deal for anyone watching who just drops the EA Zoom groups name with me upon booking. And I think that that's all for now.
Okay, thank you so much. That was so interesting. Just coming out of my little meditation there.
Great.
Any comments from our audience or questions?
Hi, Amanda. I have a question. Do you see Chiron playing a part in this?
Can you say a little bit more?
I guess what I'm thinking is since he was such a unique looking, individual, I guess that kind of, and I looked up the definition for queer, and they said, in the early days of it, it meant, strangeness or, oddness. So that's kind of why I thought of Chiron, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really something that I've thought about, but if I'm just riffing on it, two things come to mind. One is, this kind of wounded healer message that, we tend to associate with Chiron right off the bat. It's like, that's the easiest go-to. Chiron's a wounded healer. And so there is something in, queerness, or what I've been talking about, the acceptance of one's own difference being really strong, and the importance of like community acceptance of difference. And so a lot of the, some of the ways that I work with Chiron is, how do you, it's a wound that you can essentially like accept and know and work with and kind of lead with, right? And then that creates a healing presence. And so there's some parallels or echoes there. The other thing that just kind of pops into my head is, and I have to think about this more, but like the discovery of Chiron is kind of like a harbinger for the age of Aquarius, right? That's when the discovery of Chiron is when we see, the re-emergence of, alternative healing therapies and, what I refer to lovingly and not as woo coming back into the collective consciousness. And because Chiron is orbiting between Saturn and Uranus, it is full of the textures of that relationship that I was talking about, the tension between the known and the unknown, right? The tension between the manifest and the subtle. So I think, yeah, I think that's a really great question, and you're onto something there.
Great. Amanda, is the LGB community not just about sex? Could it be about also different types of friendships or interests or groups or anything alternative?
Absolutely. And that's that kind of bracket, is it's not just about sexual identity or gender identity, because some people within that community don't fall under either of those brackets at all in terms of their difference. And so, yeah, it can just be about community and friendship as well. And that's resonance with the Aquarian archetype too.
Great, thank you. Any final questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, Amanda. We'll catch you next time. Would you all please thank Amanda Moreno, everybody?
Thank you, Amanda. This was so thought-provoking.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was very interesting.
You're welcome.